So welcome everyone. My name's Jackie Fernandez Hamburg. I'm the curator of the Sheldon Jackson Museum, and we're pleased to welcome you to this event. This is our second presentation and lecture in the Friends Winter Series. The Winter Series is Share Your Culture, Share Your Research. We have a wonderful lineup for folks, so please keep your eyes peeled for upcoming events. The next event that we have in this series will be on January 19th. We'll have indigenous Yupiit fashion designer Bobby Ita presenting on her parkas and other things that she makes that are just stunning, and talking a little bit about her career. And I would like to introduce Jen, but before I do that, I'll start off with the land acknowledgement. And I also want to mention to you that the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum, in addition to having this series, have been helping us get the word out about a current initiative for the Sheldon Jackson Museum to carry out an interpretive plan survey. This interpretive plan that we are undertaking will take input from folks who share responses to the survey questions. So I'll type the survey link in the chat. Feel free to go to that at your own free time. If you can, answer some questions for us and help us get further along with the interpretive plan work. And I'll start off with the land acknowledgement to introduce Jen. So welcome to this event from the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum. This is the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum's acknowledgement. Please join us in acknowledging and expressing our appreciation to the indigenous people of Tlingit who have occupied this land for longer than any of us can imagine. And after 250 years of colonization in Alaska, are graciously allowing us to share this amazing land with them. Thank you. In Jen's presentation, Ancestral Inspirations, Modern Visions, Wood will share images of her carvings and talk about her artwork and creative process and cultural heritage. Jennifer Angaiak Wood's artwork is inspired by her upbringing and heritage, but melds the contemporary and the traditional. Wood was born and raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, but has familial Yupiit roots in Tununuk, Alaska, a place she spent her summers while growing up. The experiences she had in the villages of Tununuk on the northwest side of Nelson Island in the Bering Sea greatly informed her artistic expression, and the masks she carves are stylistically reminiscent of masks found in that region. Although her designs are inspired by ancestral carvings, Wood incorporates modern materials and concepts to emphasize that the Yupiit and all indigenous peoples have contemporary culture, not just a historic one. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jen. And there will be a Q&A at the end. Everyone, you can type questions in the chat at the end. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thank you, Jackie. And thank you to everyone who is here today and maybe will watch this later. My name is Jennifer Angaiak Wood. I'm Yupiit, Irish, and Italian. And although I'm primarily a carver, I also do printmaking, beadwork, painting, and mosaics recently. Really kind of anything I can get my hands on. My parents are Marie and Andy Angaiak of Fairbanks, Alaska, and my grandparents are Mike and Susie Angaiak of Tununuk, Alaska, and Kip and Pat Morey of Menlo Park, California. And that in Yupiit culture, we are expected to introduce ourselves with our parents and grandparents. That is how people know who you are. And the last time, I went to Tununuk in 2018 and hadn't been there in 17 years. And the people I ran into, the first thing they said is, "Who's your dad?" Because they were pretty sure they knew who I was, but they just wanted to make sure. I also want to note that I am just one person of tens of thousands of Yupiit people. And so this is my perspective. This is my understanding of my heritage and my culture. And it is pretty specific to Nelson Island, though I'll also talk about some of the other resources that I use when I am creating my work. There we go. So as Jackie said, my Yupiit family is from Tununuk, Alaska, on the coast of the Bering Sea. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but it's this, I underlined it here in blue. The only way to get out there is by airplane or boat. And so the top left photo is 2018 when I brought my husband and 2 kids out there. It was their first visit. And then you can see Tununuk, an aerial view. And then the tundra, this area has really informed my connection with land. And I really love being around water and windy places. It's definitely a happy place for me to be out there. This is the top picture is Tununuk from the airstrip. We call it the airport, but really it's just a big long gravel strip. And then Cape Vancouver is sort of the main access to the Bering Sea. That top house there is the house that my dad grew up in with his 10 surviving siblings. And the small black structure behind it is the fish storage house, or what was the fish storage house when I was a kid. And that's where my grandmother stored all of the dried fish that they processed. And then they still have a lot of subsistence lifestyle. And the lower right is herring drying racks. And you can see some of the braided grass that's used to dry the herring. One of our jobs, and when we would go and stay out there in the summer, was to help take down the herring fish. When it was dried, we would twist the head off, put the head in one bucket, the body in another, and we would sing a fish head song. It was a very good memory. But I also want to point out that this is changing pretty dramatically because of climate change. The shoreline is very heavily eroded, and even from 2018 to my visit out there this summer, 5-year difference, the shore has come noticeably inland. So some of these fish racks are falling down because of that. The top 2 pictures include photos of my appa, my grandpa, and my grandma. So my appa in the left picture there is explaining the use of a traditional bent knife. And then my grandma in that upper right picture is the one in the lighter colored parka. The lower left photo are men in the Tununuk men's house. I apologize, I don't speak Yupiit. I don't know how to correctly pronounce that word. But this is where historically dances would take place, ceremonies, things like that. And then the lower right, my grandma is there on the left-hand side. She and my appa were very well-respected Yupiit singers and dancers and storytellers, and were flown into Fairbanks to be elders in residence at UAF. So to get into the background of the artwork that I do, I am deeply informed by my Yupiit heritage. And in a lot of pieces, pretty much everything is decorated with these line drawings. And all of these lines tell a story of some sort. We don't always know what the stories were if they weren't, if the stories weren't written down when the pieces were collected. So sometimes the family history of the pieces was just sort of lost. But all of these have significance to the person who created them. The geometric designs are often a reference to our cosmology and spirituality, our connection to the world around us and to the spirit world and the animal world. The lines that are inside of animals often represent their spirit. So there's a picture of a bull in a couple of slides, and there's a line that connects a bird's mouth, and then it sort of squiggles into its stomach, and then leaves through the other side. And it sort of tracks the internal structure of the animal, but also tracks the spirit of that animal. And it was really important to make sure you handled the bodies of animals correctly so that their spirits would be pleased with what you did and they would offer themselves back to you. And I'll reference that quite a number of times. And then when you see these really complex designs, like the ivory piece on the bottom, they tell a history of some sort. Sometimes it's cultural to the region, and sometimes it is a family story. There are a lot of wooden bowls. The Yupiit region actually does not have any large trees, and we were heavily reliant, though, on driftwood. And so a lot of these larger pieces would have been collected up in the spring into the summer, whenever the ocean ice went out, and whatever driftwood was up in the rivers, the Yukon, Kuskokwim, it would flow out into the bay and then wash up on shore. And there were different ways to identify what wood would be good for what items. So there are a lot of these bentwood bowls. These were made watertight, and I didn't realize this until I first got to go to the Anchorage Museum and study their archives. But if you look on the lower right there, you can see a sort of a little curve in the edge of the bowl, and that curve matches the separate carved bottom part, and they were perfectly sealed together. So these bowls could be used for holding seal oil and water and cooking and eating. Is really, really quite amazing to me. Here's some other carved items, a lot of spoons. And my parents, in fact, have a wooden spoon that my Appa carved for them many, many years ago, sort of triangular shaped. Snow goggles, sort of the first sunglasses of the world. And then that lower one is a piece that I got to see at the Anchorage Museum. It's part of the Smithsonian collection, and they think it's a snuff box. But there are a lot of these really beautiful, highly decorative snuff boxes. And this one would have been created after Western contact, because these are glass beads that are inlaid into the seals. So the overall concepts of Yupik mask carving, they were primarily danced during ceremonies and celebrations. Sometimes they were spiritual and had very heavy spiritual meaning, and sometimes they were just for fun. Maybe they were telling a funny story about somebody, but a lot of times they were our way of prayer. That's also part of the reason why a lot of the dances were banned when missionaries started coming out into villages. They equated the dancing and the singing with devil worship. So the resurgence of dancing is sort of spotty and has come and gone in different places. I was out in Quinhagak this last summer, and it's really exciting. They have just started up their own dance group, and it's all been started by young people in that community. So it's a really beautiful thing to see. And I feel fortunate that I grew up getting to see these dances from the time I was little in Tununuk. Masks were mostly designed by shamans. They would have visions of the mask and the purpose, and they would either carve them themselves, or sometimes there were carvers in the community, and the shaman would describe what they wanted, and then the carver would create it for them. But also they had artistic license. Whatever they understood the description to be is how they would carve it. The masks were very powerful and helped people interact with the spirit world. So when you see different appendages and different markings on masks, those all had purpose and intent. One that I find really interesting is sometimes you'll see masks that have black painted around the eyes. It almost looks like they're wearing eyeglasses. But in my understanding, that was a way of protecting people from the spirit world in some of these different festivals and feasts that they would have. Masks representing plants and animals were intended to honor them. There is a really extensive set of rules that people were expected to live by that were honoring of the animals and plants that agreed to support human beings. So the agreement was humans are actually sort of weak on our own. We can't live outside without, warmth and clothing. It's difficult for us to make shelter without having additional materials. And so the agreement was, creator said that that humans are valuable, but they need a lot of help. And plants and animals, one by one, agreed that they would support us as long as we lived correctly. So even driftwood got masks to show that we understood our place and we were being respectful. And then many masks were meant to be temporary and were either burned or left out on the tundra. And there are a number of pieces in different museums that were collected off of the tundra or pulled out of fires before they were burned, which is part of the reason we don't know the stories that are supposed to go with them. So a lot of times you'll see asymmetry in Yupiq carvings. It is very common in shaman masks. Tununuk, hopefully I don't know if I pronounced that right, but helper spirit masks, and they represent our connection to the spirit world. And I always find this really interesting. I never knew why there were so many Yupiq masks in museums in Europe, but it is because the surrealists were obsessed with Yupiq masks because they saw these images and were really taken aback by the lack of symmetry and sort of these twisted up faces. And so these masks were collected by surrealists and added to their collections throughout Europe. You will oftentimes see universe rings and appendages. If you see a mask without these, it is most likely that they were lost somewhere along the way. Sometimes these masks entered collections and they either aged faster than people expected or they weren't really handled the correct way. But these rings represent the universe and our place in it. A very common motif in Yupiq art, and actually I've learned in other areas of the world too, is called the circle and dot motif. And the dot is us and the circle is everything around us. But what's important is that dot can't be separated from anything else. So it's a reminder that we're just one part in this whole big wide world, and we have a responsibility to take care of it. These rings can be whole or partial, and the carvers would get these long strips of wood and soften them in water and then actually chew on them in order to break down the fibers and get the bend that they wanted. And I was at the Burke Museum a couple of months ago, and you can still observe these bite marks in these rings. And then the appendages represent everything from the animal to the way that hunters would treat the animal so that the spirit could return. So if you see those, the hands on the left hand mask, the holes inside, my understanding is the hole is intended to, so you capture the animal, but the spirit continues on. And Yupiq people, I'm pretty sure most indigenous people don't ever say that they killed an animal. They say that they caught it or harvested it, because words have power. And if you say that you killed it, then you are preventing that spirit from ever coming back. And then there is just a huge wide variety of Yupiq masks. They represent spirit and the way that people connect with it. And there's no one way that this has been visualized by people of my ancestry. And you'll see different motifs throughout the entire Yupiq region. When you see pieces like that middle one with the human face inside what is a fox or maybe a wolf, is the human spirit of the animal, called either a Yua or an Inua. And Yupiq people believe that animals had a human spirit inside of them and therefore could become or present themselves in a human form. I like this idea because it emphasizes the fact that you never quite know who you're talking to if you run into a stranger, and you could be getting checked up on by an animal. And then many stories and the correct attachment placements are unknown. Again, sometimes these pieces were collected up off of the tundra or, off of someone's trash pile. Sometimes the attachments fell out. There's a really big collection, part of which is housed at the Burke. I just learned about this, the Gurkey collection. And the original collector was gifted the masks upon his request after he helped the community get food for the winter, but they broke all the appendages off themselves before they gifted him the masks. So the placement of them is just people's best guesses. So we're not always sure if the placement is correct. So I have to do a lot of reading. I grew up in Fairbanks, spent a lot of time in Tununuk growing up, but didn't have a whole lot of conversation around artwork and masks other than my grandma wove baskets. But I feel fortunate that there are a whole lot of books with different photos and documentation about these different pieces, where they're from, what they possibly meant. And the other benefit is the researchers, Anne Feinup Reardon is sort of the best known one, but they're really committed to making sure they have the correct information down. So not making assumptions, not putting words into people's mouths, but really going to the source, and also hiring Yupiit translators to make sure they're getting the correct translations when the stories are only spoken in Yupiit. And in fact, I can't remember which book it is, but Anne Reardon issued a correction. She had initially published something that ended up being not entirely correct, and she went back and said, this wasn't correct, here's the new version. And not all communities have that benefit. And then there's also some tribes and cultural groups where the elders have not allowed the stories to be written down. I entirely respect that position, but I am glad that Yupiit elders have decided that this is one of the best and really only ways in the modern world that a lot of us can have access to this information, because people end up outside of their home communities for all sorts of reasons. And for me, it's a blessing that I'm able to pick up these books and read these stories and feel these connections to my ancestors. These are my workspaces. The first one is, it's actually a garden shed, but I've made it into a little outdoor studio space for me. It's really nice because it's got all those windows, so there's a lot of light out there. This photo in the upper right was taken in a much tidier time. It doesn't look like that right now. In fact, I have a big pile of wood chips that I need to clean up. The lower left is the garage space that I've taken over. It's actually a little more tidy now. I have a new big bench drawer set up. But I am a pretty prolific collector of things. So I find stuff I think it maybe will be interesting, or I'm gifted some materials, and then I just sort of sock it away until a piece tells me that it wants something from my collection. And then the lower right are the primary carving tools that I use, chisels and bent knives. I learned carving from an Athabascan man named Ron Manuk in high school, and he taught me with chisels. So that set on the left-hand side there were a gift from my parents. They had a parent-teacher conference with him, said that I really seemed to love carving, and did he think that they should invest in a set of tools because these are pretty expensive? And he said yes. And I still use these tools to this day. And I've only added tools since I've moved to the Seattle area, and people have taught me more about these traditional bent knives that you can see in the right-hand side of that photo. The ads, by the way, I made in college. I was lucky enough to take a class from Marvin Oliver, who is a quinault artist, and he passed away recently. But I still use that as well. It's my only one. It's not the greatest since I made it, but it does its job. I carve primarily using red cedar, yellow cedar, green alder, and then basswood. If you have any wood blinds in your house, it's usually made from basswood because it has very, very straight, consistent grain. So basswood is what I learned to use. And then when I moved to to Washington State, I was lucky enough to go to some artist gatherings, and I learned about carving these other woods. Alder can really only be carved green. It's a hardwood, and once the moisture is out, it is very, very difficult to carve. And I'm told in Alaska, it's really similar to carving birch. So if you get a piece of green birch, it carves really nicely, but as it dries out, it gets really hard. That lower left corner is people collecting up driftwood. And mask carvers would go through and they would be able to tell exactly what pieces would make a mask eventually. There's some really cool materials that I'd have to dig out, but they'd be able to find the front part of kayaks, which were like the curved part of where a tree root came out, like a primary root came off of it. And then that lower right picture is an example of a driftwood spirit mask. And those masks would be danced to request that the driftwood come back each year. This was the primary source of also heat for people. So they would get a huge pile of driftwood so that they could have fires year round. So my artistic purposes is to educate my audience about indigenous peoples in general and Yupiit culture in particular. Of course, there are similarities in indigenous peoples, connections to the land, connection to the spirit of the land, but we're not all the same. And so I like to acknowledge those similarities, but then also point out the things that are specific to my heritage. I'm a big fan of using stories to draw people into the work. I don't, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 masks, I don't think I've really ever made a mask that didn't have a story or a purpose. And I really want people to connect to the universality of the stories and the emotions, and really to see a bit of themselves in this culture that they maybe don't really even know anything about. I want to bridge communities, both past and present. Something that I have found as I get older is people continue to put indigenous peoples in the past. Years ago, there was a study done of high school history textbooks, and they found that 60% of them had no mention of Native American people after the year 1900. And even when I was a teenager, I worked at a tourist place in Fairbanks, and I can't tell you how many people would say that they thought Native American people were gone. And so one of my goals is to sort of pull on my ancestry, but then also show that we're not gone. We're here and we are doing well, doing better than we were. And our art is really coming back, and it's really bringing back that the spirit of our ancestors. And then personally, I like to experiment and push my practice in new directions. Sometimes this results in absolutely magnificent failures, but a lot of times I find that interesting things happen. Not all people agree with this approach. They think that it's better to stick with the imagery and the concepts that were done before. But my argument is that indigenous people and people who live off the land always have to adapt. And as long as I'm receiving support from my home communities, then I feel okay about what I'm doing. So these first few slides, these are examples of these are Yupiit masks but I wanted to show how I use the imagery of previous masks in order to inform the work that I do. I never, ever, ever directly copy an old piece. I don't know what the story was for a lot of them. I don't know the purpose. And like I said before, these are really spiritual objects, and I don't want to tap into that, especially without any kind of acknowledgement or permission of what the original purpose was. The lower right is probably my absolute favorite mask. I have been able to see this in person. It's in the collections of the Burke Museum, but that is a seal with a little it's Yua poking out of the mouth. So I took that image and I made it into a fish. Growing up, one of my biggest connections was checking nets with my appa out on the river, going drift netting for salmon, and then, like I said before, helping process herring fish. And so I sort of borrowed that imagery and made it into this, and then also used some dyed seashells for the outer portion. And then the one on the left is, so the previous mask was a wind mask, relating to a lot to storms and big winds. This one, though, is only about a total of maybe 7 inches high. And this one is to honor the little breezes. People get the people who get the most attention are the really loud ones, but I have found that it's oftentimes the quiet ones who have a lot to say as well. These are more traditional or historic masks, I should say. The one on the left is believed to be a partial moon mask. The one on the upper right is a shaman helper spirit mask. Masks like that were called stick to your face masks, and the stories are they would be laid face down on the floor, and then the shaman would lean over it with their face down, and then the mask would actually rise up off the ground and stick to the shaman's face until the end of the dance. And then the lower right one is a seal mask. And then these are the pieces that I came up with from those original ideas. And the lower right one, that's the seal mask. That is one that doesn't really have a story because I just wanted to experiment with that form. And I do a lot of seals in my work. This, I just wanted to show the side-by-side comparison of how these historic pieces interact with the concepts that I use. These are not at all size accurate. I just wanted to give a visual of how these ideas translate into the work that I do. So one of my goals is storytelling. The mask on the left represents the times that I spent, me and my siblings spent going out to check nets with my appa. I don't even know what kind of fish they were. We just called them whitefish, but it was so fun to go on the boat with him. I distinctly remember my younger brother and I would lay out on the front of the little aluminum boat and just look down at the water as we sped down the river. And then the little face is me. The piece on the upper right represents a story from the Coast Salish region about everyone working together. So the original story was that creator made the world, but the sky was too low. And so everyone had to work together to help push the sky back up to where it needs to be. And then the lower right is my visualization of that feeling when you really, really want to laugh at something, but you can't. It's not the appropriate time, or maybe you'll get in trouble. So you're doing everything you can to keep it inside. The mask on the left is when I was out in Tununuk in 2018, I noticed there were all these black birds that were washed up on the shore. And I had never seen that before. All I'd ever seen was maybe a seagull here and there. so I asked my Auntie Anna about it, and she said that those were birds that were normally farther north and farther out to sea at that time of year, but because of climate change, they're having a harder time finding their food, and so they're traveling further south to find food, but they're dying. So I did a bunch of research about what bird that was likely to be, and I believe it's a short-tailed shearwater. And when I posted the picture of this mask, a connection I have in New Zealand said that their elders have noticed that the short-tailed shearwaters have not been showing up. And I didn't know this, but those birds migrate between New Zealand and Alaska. So it was this really amazing connection, this observation that I had made being connected to an entirely different region of the world. The mask on the upper right is an LGBTQ honoring mask. In the history of Yupiit people, they were very open and accepting of whoever people were. My dad tells a story when he was a young boy. There was a person who was physically a man and chose to wear women's clothes and do women's work. And my dad asked his dad about that. And, he said, why does he wear women's clothes? And my uppa's response was, that's just who he is. So I wanted to really capture that with this piece. And then similarly, the one on the lower right is about sort of finding who you really are and being happy with that. And then these last couple slides show a little bit of process. If there's anyone who's ever worked with wood or I'm always interested to talk to clay artists. I really struggle with clay, but they have an additive process in a lot of ways, and I have a removal process. And then also once you remove a piece of wood, you can't always put it back on. So sometimes you just have to deal with it. So this is a small piece of alder. The original was probably about 5 inches tall, maybe 5 inches tall by 4 inches wide. And so I stripped the bark off. You can see alder starts really nice, creamy white, but it oxidizes to a red over time. And then this was a mask that I started out with one design and then pretty dramatically changed it as I was working on it. I consider carving to be a negotiation. So I'm asking the wood to do something, and it can either agree to go with what I want or not. And my job is to listen and pay attention and see if I am doing the correct thing. And in the original mask, those hoops that would be off the top were rings of wood. And so I wanted to mimic that, but do much softer. So that's beach grass from Tununuk. And then instead of big carved wood feathers, I used little feather tufts. And I think this is the last one. I'm trying to remember, but this is the mask I was talking about, where it was originally based on the seal, and then I made it into a salmon. And this is an example of the original design, or the way I had it in my head didn't have these openings that you can see in the lower center, the openings along the side. But as I was working on it, it just seemed like the right thing to do. So that's what I did. And that is all I have to say about that.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was wonderful. I have a few questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience first. If you have a question, please go ahead and enter it into chat. And also please note that in the chat, there is that link to the interpretive plan survey. If you can take a moment, help us out, fill that out after the talk, that would be great. Okay, so no questions yet from the audience. So Jen, I have 2 questions for you. The first question is, how do you choose what stories to use to draw people in?
Oh, that's a good question. I think part of it are stories that I think people should know. I was a teacher for 10 years, 3 of those years down here in Washington State. And I remember I had a poster up on my wall. The photos were taken by a friend of mine, and the message was it was something like all are welcome here. And the one poster showed women in a romantic relationship, and the other one showed men in a romantic relationship. And one of my students was really put off by that. And so I asked him some questions about his history and what he had learned. And then I shared what I had been taught growing up. And I just felt it was important because the acceptance of gender fluidity and identity fluidity was really suppressed during the missionary period. And so I just wanted to kind of harken back to that original story. And then sometimes it's just something that I find entertaining, like the one about not laughing. I'm pretty sure all people have been in that moment where they would love to burst out laughing, but they just can't. And if they do, they get a bunch of dirty looks and a bunch of eyes rolling. So I just wanted to, it was sort of a personal challenge to see if I could capture what that feels like when you're trying not to laugh.
That's great. And then my next question is, could you talk a little bit about your experience in Quinnipiac and just share with people what Quinnipiac is? And then after that, we'll turn it over to the audience. If anyone has a question, please feel free to type it in the chat. Thanks, Jen.
So out in Quinnipiac, there is an archaeological dig. I'm actually wearing my sweatshirt from the museum. But so I mentioned before that the coastline is changing really dramatically because of climate change. And I think 15, 16 years ago, something like that, some residents of Quinnipiac started finding artifacts that were washing out of the edge of the shoreline. And the leaders of the community tried to connect with multiple different agencies and universities and didn't have any takers, and then finally connected with the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, because they have a history of connecting with communities and really doing community-based archaeology. And the elders of the community decided, so normally in Yupiit communities, you do not go to old sites. You're just supposed to leave everything as it is. But they decided, because it was already coming out of the ground because of erosion from larger winter storms, that they were going to have an active archaeological dig. So each summer they go out there and invite guest students and archaeologists, and then people like me who just want to learn more, to go out and participate in the dig. And I actually injured my foot the night before I left. So I couldn't spend that much time actually on the dig site, because you had to walk a mile down the beach in order to get there. But one morning they arranged for me to take a ride out on a four-wheeler. And I was about to hitch a ride back with a couple of young men from the community. But then someone came up and said, they think they found a mask. And so it's all still in frozen permafrost. And so, typically they'll take away a layer and then let the top layer thaw, and then just do that over and over all summer. But they were working on closing up the site. So they're getting the last few objects out because they're worried that that area is going to get washed into the sea this winter. And so they were getting hot water. They were boiling water and pouring it onto this spot, and then gently removing the mud from around this piece. And sure enough, it ended up being a mask. And so they've raised funds in order to have a community-based museum. So they have the world's largest collection of Yupik artifacts out in Quinhagak, Alaska, that you have to take a plane to get to. And it is just incredible. Just drawers upon drawers of all of these different items. They have found baskets that they've been able to preserve in the condition that they were in, masks, arrow points, dolls, just a whole lot of everything. And so I also got to participate in a dance fan making class, because they also bring out, they've done a cussbuck making class, dance fans, and there's one other that I'm forgetting, but it's a really, really incredible project.
Oh, that's great. I'm so glad you got to go. It sounds really meaningful. Anybody have any question for Jen before we wrap up? Okay. The question in the chat from Lori, thank you, Lori. Is wood carving your primary focus? How did you get introduced to it? And were there other art forms that led the way? And also, do you teach classes?
Wood carving is my primary focus. So my earliest exposure to Alaska Native art of any kind was my grandma. She made grass baskets, and I just put ours away yesterday because we put up our holiday decorations, but I spent, I don't even know how many hours when we'd be out in Tununuk. She would just sit on the floor and she'd have her bag of grass next to her, and I was so amazed by how precise her baskets were, and how consistent they were, and how good she was. I mean, it was just this natural, she wouldn't even look at the pile of grass next to her. She would just feel when she needed to add more, and then, you know, add to the filler part, and then would just continue sewing. And then when I was in elementary school, I was part of the Alaska Native Ed program up there in Fairbanks. And so I learned a little bit of beading. And then when I was in high school, I went to West Valley, and there was an Alaska Native art class, and Ron Minuk, the teacher, would I mean, anyone was allowed to take his class, but he really sought out Alaska Native kids. And I just really took to it and absolutely loved it. And I feel fortunate down in this area. I've been able to meet other carvers and learn a lot more, and sort of expand my horizons that way. But I also just like creating all sorts of things. So I've done printmaking, painting, stained glass, mosaics, but I always try to integrate the carving part into it. And I haven't taught classes yet, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. One of the biggest issues is having access. There are not a whole lot of carvers left out in my region, and I want to figure out a way to make this information accessible in order for people to also learn and continue the art form. Was that the whole thing? I can't remember.
That's great. Yeah, I think that covers everything. Thank you so much. And then Mike has asked, he says that I found that wood often determines the carving. Is that true with other carvers? Do you find that to be the case?
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes a piece will go along with exactly what I'm hoping for, but that's pretty rare. What I find usually is that I will start with an idea in mind, and then the wood really dictates what the final piece looks like. I call it finding the curves, where I will start carving a certain piece, and then all of a sudden it'll go a different direction. And actually the mask with the net, the beaded net along the forehead, that was supposed to be an entirely different piece, But as I was working on it, it would not do what I wanted it to do. The wood was tearing, which is really unusual for alder, which is what that mask is made out of. I would like try to take off a little piece, and my chisel would dig down deeper. And finally I set it aside, because I was like, this is obviously not what this mask wants to be. And I just sat and stared at it for a while, which is something that Mr. Tununuk taught us to do. If you're stuck, just stare and see what emerges. It's sort of the Michelangelo philosophy of remove whatever's not supposed to be there. And the mask that I ended up carving is what came out of it. And once I made that decision, once I followed what the piece of wood was saying, I didn't have any more problems after that. It was really amazing. It was definitely telling me what it wanted to do.
That's great. Any last question for Jen? No. Okay, well, Jen, thank you so much for being with us today. It was wonderful to have you as a speaker in the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum Winter Series. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone who took some time out of their day to come and listen to me talk about Yupiit art.
Have a wonderful day. Everybody, if you get a chance, please do fill out that survey. Just check the link. And we hope to see you January 19th for fashion designer Bobby Ita's presentation. It'll be virtual on Zoom, just like this event was. And we'll have other events coming up throughout the winter sponsored by the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum. Thanks again. Take care. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.